Paris Perspective.
Hello and welcome to this edition of Paris Perspective with me, David Coffey. Well, Australia has formally embarked on its controversial programme to equip its navy with nuclear-powered submarines in a new defence alliance with Britain and the United States. Now, the tripartite agreement allows for the exchange of sensitive naval nuclear propulsion information between the three nations in a bid to confront strategic tensions in the Indo-Pacific region. Now, China, for its part, has called the agreement extremely irresponsible. The so-called AUKUS Pact, however, came at the expense of collapsing a $56 billion deal signed with Paris in 2016, which was to supply Canberra with diesel-powered submarines. France described the move as a stab in the back and infuriated by the secretive way, in which Australia and the US and Britain collaborated to ditch the French vessels. Now, this prompted France to take the highly unusual step of temporarily recalling its ambassador from Washington. Now, to discuss the current state of Franco-US relations and indeed the Biden administration, I'm joined in studio today by former US diplomat William Jordan. William, it's great to have you on the programme today.
Thank you very much, David.
Well, let's look at this whole debacle. In the wake of that diplomatic spat between the US and France over the AUKUS deal, Vice President Kamala Harris was sent to Paris to smooth over all of the crumpled and ruffled feathers that came out of that announcement of the AUKUS deal. Was her mission a success? Is it now water under the bridge between Paris and Washington?
I don't think it's water under the bridge at all. And in fact, Harris's visit was preceded by discussions directly between President Biden and President Macron in the run-up to the recent climate summit in Glasgow. I think they met in Rome. That's right. The G20, and it was very clear there that the French position was going to be very much one of making the Americans grovel a little bit more to show that they were going to be friendly again and they were going to be open and honest in their dealings with France. So I think there's going to be a little bit more water under this bridge, but everything that I've heard is that, at least as far as the official accounts are concerned, coming from the American embassy here, everybody believes that the visit by Kamala Harris was positive. And let's face it, if an American official visits Paris, participates in all the meetings, sticks to predictable talking points, doesn't sulk, and doesn't sort of refuse to attend certain things because they're afraid they're going to be somehow beaten up by all the other participants in these multilateral meetings, well, then it's a success.
Mm-hmm. So. And indeed, for many looking, from a European perspective or indeed a Paris perspective, this was really, it seemed to be Kamala Harris's first kind of step onto the world stage. It was definitely when she was given the remit, if you would, to discuss things like Libya, the defense situation there, and the upcoming elections that are happening there. So what about Kamala Harris when it comes to her position as VP back in the States? Everybody was expecting when Biden was elected that she would take very much charge of a lot of the big dossiers because Biden, with the age that he is, would need her very much as his right-hand woman. But she hasn't really shone or hasn't been allowed shine. Is that correct?
I think it's probably more that she hasn't been allowed to shine, and I think there may be a couple of reasons for that. I mean, first of all, I don't tend to credit a lot of the chit-chat and the gossip-based reporting or in fact commentary that passes for reporting in the American media these days, trying to talk about Kamala Harris being sidelined or a great disappointment. I would credit a lot of the accounts that there's tension between the staffs to Vice President Harris and the president, simply because in the high-pressure media environment that is Washington now, and with the Biden administration seeming to make so many missteps that were never expected, it's inevitable that tension is going to play itself out, at the level of the two staffs. But I think that a lot of this is oversold, and it's purely so certain opposition media like Fox News in the United States can sell airtime and that kind of thing. What I think is more important, though, is that Kamala Harris came on and with the idea that not only was she going to be the last person in the room, and sort of like the Obama-Biden relationship during President Obama's presidency, that she would be the person that the president would always talk to, would always confide in, and would seek the advice of, and would be delegated certain key responsibilities. This is a testing phase. This is very much a phase of developing experience for Kamala Harris as vice president. And I think, the fact that she was given such major responsibilities right off the bat for something that I don't think the Biden administration truly understood was as difficult as it was, namely migration from Central America, that has proven to be very, very difficult to resolve. Mm-hmm. And as a consequence, I think it's understandable, perhaps, that that has sort of faded into the background, and that while she finds something that's a little bit easier and a little bit more likely to lead to a successful outcome, she's taken more of a publicly backseat mm-hmm. role. But I do think that it was significant that she was assigned this particular task because clearly it was a priority of the Biden administration to try to correct all of that had come out of this AUKUS or AUKUS shift in the torpedoing, if I can use that word, of the submarine deal between France and Australia.
Now, Biden indeed has admitted that his handling of the affair, or the handling, maybe not his handling, but the handling of the affair was clumsy. And he said he thought that the French were in the loop. He was kind of he was as contrite as an American president could be in this situation. But looking now to the fallout of this AUKUS deal, the French Foreign Minister Jean-Yves Le Drian is currently looking to set up a very significant deal with Indonesia, which will be a strategic repositioning since Canberra is no longer in favour here in Paris, even to the point that before he left, Le Drian went to Jakarta, he omitted Australia from the list of allies that were traditionally on France's side. But let's have a look. I mean, I think there's 36 Rafale jets are carded or have been slated to be sold. It has yet to be inked itself, that deal. Australia's cold-shouldered, but what exactly are we looking at in the Indo-Pacific region? China has been incredibly successful because it hasn't been engaged in any outward war. What is happening? Why there's a huge military buildup, it would appear here. Is this really going to be the next conflict zone? And what is France's role to play in this?
Well, before I get to all of that, let me just say something about the whole debacle over the submarine deal. I do think that President Biden was genuinely unaware, and the administration may not have been fully aware of the dynamic between France and Australia in terms of the contract. There's a lot going on here that I think has much to do with Britain's difficult relationship with the EU and France in particular in the wake of Brexit.
And anything to do with the transition from the Trump to the Biden administration?
Well, and that too. There are a number of things that are playing out here. I mean, on the one hand, you have this apparent secretly concluded deal for the Australians to opt for nuclear submarines where they had originally accepted conventionally powered diesel submarines, which was just a total change of the Australian opposition to any kind of nuclear propulsion in the past. So there are a lot of questions about that. Why did they make that change? What was it purely a financial deal? Then there's the issue of, and I don't know the degree to which France was actually a part of this, but when you have, and this is where all blows are sort of accepted. I mean, there are no holds barred when it comes to arms sales competition. I think the U.S. saw, and this probably goes back to the Trump administration, they saw an opportunity here that the Australians were giving them to sell these nuclear submarines. And I mean, that's huge. This is, and it's not the first time that the Americans have pulled the rug out from under a French arms deal and vice versa. I mean, it's happened on the other side too. And so the degree to which, all of this was overplayed and oversold, and remember, this is sort of an August crisis in France, has yet to be determined. I'm convinced that the British had more of a role than has been let on. The Australians clearly seem to be the party most in the doghouse as far as Paris is concerned.
Scott Morrison has been, I think, vociferously unapologetic.
Right. And I think one of the things that I remember very clearly listening to all of this play out back in August and September was that even people within the government party here in France had questions about all of what had actually happened and why Le Drian was carrying on the way that he was. And there were calls for some sort of congressional inquiry, or not congressional, parliamentary inquiry into all of this. And I thought, well, we'll never get that from the American side, but maybe the French will actually have a parliamentary inquiry. And no hearings have taken place. Nothing has followed up. And that makes me think that there is perhaps less here than the theatrics. So I just wanted to say all of that before I then answered your.
And it did come out in August when things were running slow.
Right.
Okay.
But to answer your more immediate question, I mean, I think the French, as far as I see it, the French policy towards Indo-Pacific and the whole idea of taking on a more confrontational line vis-a-vis China. Mm-hmm. Has been very ambiguous, to say the least. The French, or in fact, it was around, I think it was also in the summer, the French made a big deal about having sent a nuclear submarine on a worldwide patrol that included going through some of the disputed waters in the South China Sea around that time. But up until then, every time the U.S. had tried to get France and other countries in Europe to line up beside it against China, the reaction has been sort of, well, not quite. Mm-hmm. We don't exactly want to go all the way down that road. And so I think what I see happening now is almost a bit of catch up. Again, let's look at the money. I mean, the fact that the French looking to Indonesia may be wanting to sell Rafale fighters, which until a couple of years ago was a difficult product for the French to sell. If they're now, back on another spree of trying to get potential buyers, and they're going to be turning to the Indo-Pacific region because France has already started to talk more and more about its own pivot towards Asia, then I sort of see a lot of this in that context. It's Le Drian saying to the Indo-Pac countries as well as to the United States and everybody else that, hey, we matter, hey, we've got interests, and we're here and we intend to be more active. The big question, though, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, is the degree to which this is France going it alone, or is this going to be woven into some larger Western initiative? And if that's the case, where exactly does Europe as a whole fit in? Because at the moment, the last thing one would say about Europe is that it has a very cohesive, coherent, or consolidated policy.
Indeed, there is no common defence policy for Europe, and that has always been something that states such as Ireland have always been vociferously against, of course, being, you have neutral states and the like. But indeed, coming back to Europe, one could say that we are facing a power vacuum at the helm of the European Union, with Angela Merkel being the de facto leader of the European bloc. She's on her way out. So what does that mean for Macron's role, and what does that mean now for relations directly between Macron and Biden? Macron, is he going to be filling the shoes of Merkel until, let's just say, Germany gets its affairs in order?
Well, I think he'd like to. I mean, Macron has been trying since he came in 2007, came into office in 2017, to sort of be the leading voice in many aspects of the European project, and he's sort of off and on been either the cheerleader for a more consolidated and unified European defense and foreign policy, as well as being, the biggest critic of the lack of any kind of a policy, and then going to the point even extending it into NATO and calling NATO brain dead. I think the net result is that it underscores that Europe has no even collective leadership anymore. I think this is a consequence of Europe being as large as it is. I think it's also a function of some problems within the European leadership at the level of EU institutions. You know, the fighting between Michel and von der Leyen, you know, over who sat where
exactly,
during
with Mr. Erdogan
right
over in Ankara.
in Ankara, and I think. You know, Europe has to get its own act in order. I'm not sure, though, that there's a lot of enthusiasm for Macron stepping in. Merkel, as sort of the de facto head of Europe, I think is perhaps overstated too. I think that, you know, what Angela Merkel represented was sure, steady leadership of her own country, being the biggest economic power in the bloc, and I think the you know, from that and being sort of in a position to sort of hold off, you know, some of Emmanuel Macron's more ambitious aims, you know, has probably been the heart of her kind of role in this leadership position as she goes. And, you know, what we're seeing is really the defining of the post-Brexit European Union, because, you know, Britain used to play an important role in a lot of these things in the past. And now Britain is no longer part of it. And I think the European Union is arguably even more adrift. And so it's critical that as Angela Merkel fades from the scene, the Germans at a minimum have to come up with someone. I suspect, you know, until it's clear that Macron is reelected next year,
April,
that there's going to be a lot of casting about, looking for who sort of has a new and more effective and more attractive vision of, you know, Europe altogether than is currently the case. And I don't know where that's going to come from, but it could come from some place that either we haven't heard from for a while, like Italy,
Mario Draghi potentially,
right? Or maybe some leadership elsewhere, you know, from a smaller EU country. I just don't know.
So we'll have to watch that space. Now, it's something that you alluded to there, and it is, I suppose, part and parcel of events happening in Europe. NATO, Jens Stoltenberg has, you know, flagged up that the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance or organization is very concerned by the buildup of Russian troops on the border with Ukraine, Donbass, for this simmering war that's been going on for 7 years now. Fears are there rattling around about maybe a further annexation of eastern Ukraine after the annexation of Crimea. Indeed, you said there that Macron did call NATO brain dead. But now, with the Biden administration moving on, the pages turned from the Trump era, what has changed regarding NATO and Washington? And is the situation in Ukraine and potentially Belarus as well with the migrant issue, will that make, or does that give NATO more strategic importance now than it did, let's say, under Trump? And what's Washington's take on this?
I think, again, the first part of that, just to look at NATO, you have to take into account that what I was starting to get to in the last exchange, which was, you know, Washington is kind of looking for, you know, the European leadership. Yeah. Who are the people Washington really needs to engage with? Now, I think everybody assumed after the Trump administration left office, finally, that the Biden administration would come in, you know, and do more than just assert, you know, America's back on the world stage, and would actually begin taking steps that would both reassure its, you know, key longtime partners like the Europeans and others that, you know, and is prepared to do more to consolidate that new declarative stance in a fashion that makes it harder to return, even if, you know, there's a change of administration to another nationalistic Republican in 3 years' time. That you know, you will at least secure NATO's central role in American strategic thinking. Well, that hasn't happened, and I think the
So is America back?
well, a lot has again probably been overstated in terms of Afghanistan.
Yeah.
Which the withdrawal from Afghanistan, I think, to a lot of people was a shock.
It was a shock, indeed. I mean,
But it shouldn't have been. However, it played out as something of a collective fiasco, even though it wasn't necessarily. I mean, a lot of NATO had begun to back off of Afghanistan anyway.
sure.
But perception often ends up ruling reality, and I think that again, what has not been clear, and we will no doubt talk about the domestic political angle in Washington in a moment. Part of that is probably due. Part of what I'm describing is probably due in part to the fact that you don't have the Biden administration has not been able to get its senior officials in place to begin making changes. You don't have the ambassadors in place that you need. You don't have the senior officials at the State Department in place to craft new policies and ideas. But the Russian challenge underscores, as it has been doing for the past 15, 20 years, that NATO is no longer sort of the greatest, alliance that ever lived in the rearview mirror. It still has a reality that's important now, but nobody is yet kind of figured out, how to make NATO appear to be as robust, relevant, or ready as it was during the height of the Cold War.
Indeed, we're looking back to a couple of weeks back. We had Macron and Putin holding a 1 hour, 45-minute telephone conversation. Macron drew a line in the sand when it came to Ukraine, and then Putin put the ball back in his court, saying, well, will you please tell your friends in Washington to stop the US naval maneuvers in our backyard? Does Macron, I mean, we all know that there's a certain playbook that Putin has. He is quite unscrutable. Nobody really knows what his next move is going to be. Is he bluffing? Are we going to be looking at the gas tap being turned off as Europe heads into the winter? But by Putin saying to Macron, well, you can go back and tell your friends in Washington that they can stop playing their naval games in my backyard. Does Putin really believe that Macron has any sway over Joe Biden when it comes to what American foreign policy would be in his stomping ground?
I'm old enough to remember when the Soviets used the same playbook, or actually invented this playbook with Western Europe in the past. They always sought to find ways to sow divisions among the NATO allies. They sought to find ways, and even back then, to some extent, gas was a lever that the Soviets used. They also, you probably remember or are aware of the short range and intermediate range ballistic missiles that were only had a range that was useful in Europe but wouldn't have been useful anywhere else. Trying to intimidate Europeans to break on their side with American security guarantees, lest things escalate to a point where potentially something horrible would happen. I mean, the Europeans. So for me, Putin, being very much from that era, I think he knows that he has a lot more levers at his disposal than the Europeans do to fight back, and it would help tremendously, for example, if Europe was not as vulnerable in terms of gas supplies, and if you didn't have this Nord Stream pipeline
going through Germany,
right? That is a serious source of division and concern even for the United States. I mean, so there are all of these seams that the Russians see very clearly, and they can exploit, on the Western side. That come into play, and the thing with Ukraine is it's been for a long time. Very much, I believe, in Putin's mentality to say that, okay, how far can I push things, but with there being a clear risk that if this escalates, there's actually going to be a hot war, and is the West prepared to go to a hot war on behalf of a country that is not actually part of NATO?
Well, the other thing I'm sure that is also in Putin's mind is the US has invested I think $2 billion in military equipment, as in hot military equipment, into Ukraine over the last 7 years. Can Putin use this, according to his playbook, as a provocation and as a necessary reason for him amassing troops on the border?
Well, I don't think he can use that as a reason for amassing troops on the border. Again, the Soviets were always very adept at being able to figure out all of these sorts of ways to
niggle,
to create situations that sort of they felt legally obliged them to intervene or to be somewhat present in a certain conflict. And the Russians now are doing the same thing. I mean, by setting up this breakaway part of eastern Ukraine, much as look at what they did in 2008 with Georgia in terms of the breakaway regions of Georgia that led to that brief war. I mean, there's a lot that the Russians know they can do because in a way, either the West is going to be flat-footed or is not necessarily going to be prepared to cross a line that the Russians set, maybe even because the West doesn't fully understand it all. I mean, to tell you, to bring it all back to the early days post-Cold War, I have never understood why Germany and Poland did not insist that Russia give up the Kaliningrad enclave,
sure.
Around what used to be Königsberg. There's no reason why, that's not a Russian settled area. That was never Russian territory in the past, historically. But that, to me, exemplifies how there's a problem with how the West tends to think about these things. And these risks or these situations where Russia looks to see how far it can go, the West allows it to kind of become entrenched and all the more difficult to be able to get rid of. I mean, nowadays you could arguably come up with a deal to trade Crimea for Kaliningrad, but I mean, but nobody's looking at it that way, and and the Russians just continue to create facts on the ground. And the further and further you move away from whatever it was, like the annexation of Crimea, that was a provocation, the less and less the West is prepared to stand up to Russia to force it to back down. So, will the Russians cross, the border, or will the Russians actually, move into eastern Ukraine now? I don't know, but I think that they're probing the way that they always do to see what kind of a response they get.
Testing the fences. William Jordan, former US diplomat based here in Paris, thank you very much for being on Paris Perspective today. And thank you very much for watching Paris Perspective. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time.